Lesson 2.4 Important People. As a student journalist, it's important for you to know some of the key figures who have helped blaze the trail ahead of you. In this lesson, we're going to take a rapid fire look at some of the names in journalism history that you should know. This is really just an overview, and again, to earn the true journalism ninja warrior level status, you'd want to research on your own and find out more about these journalism greats. We're going to run through them really quickly, so you might want to pause and take notes as we go so that you can remember all of these people and why they are important. You ready? Here we go. Now, you should remember this guy from earlier lessons, Johannes Gutenberg, who in the 1400s invented the printing press you see here. You should have this down by now, so let's move on to our next one. This should be another face fairly familiar to you, Benjamin Franklin, who, if you're a big flashy spender, you might recognize from the $100 bill. Even when it comes to journalism, P. Diddy is right. It's all about the Benjamins. Okay, sorry about that. Benjamin Franklin published and printed the Pennsylvania Gazette, one of the earliest newspapers in colonial America. He, along with Thomas Paine and other early journalists, who were also forefathers of our country, published several articles and pamphlets that influenced the early inhabitants of America towards independence from England. Like you, Franklin began his journalism career when he was only a teenager, when he secretly wrote a regular column promoting free speech under the pen name Miss Silence Dogood. One of the earliest African American journalists, after risking everything to escape life as a slave, Frederick Douglass, this man here, led the movement to abolish slavery in America, in part by publishing a newspaper called the North Star. His writings and publications ultimately helped lead to the passage of the 14th Amendment, which made slavery illegal in America. You may remember this man, William Randolph Hearst, from our earlier lessons, one of the men largely responsible for the beginning of what we call yellow journalism. His newspaper, the New York Journal, was one of the largest, most influential papers at the time, and he kept buying up newspaper businesses all over the United States, creating one of the most powerful news empires in history, and becoming extremely wealthy at the same time. During the same time, Hearst's contemporary and business rival, Joseph Pulitzer, published the other popular paper, the New York World. Pulitzer also helped bring about yellow journalism because he tried to compete with the sensational and entertaining headlines that Hearst's papers produced. One of the most famous events involving both Pulitzer and Hearst occurred when the two men over-exaggerated several events that would help start the Spanish-American War. When an American ship seemed to have sunk because it hit a Spanish mine, Hearst famously told his artist on the scene to exaggerate the image and make it more dramatic, allegedly saying to his artist, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." Both men were said to have had a huge hand in bringing about the Spanish-American War, and their competition and exaggeration began some of the worst habits in journalism. After he battled with Hearst for readers and circulation, Pulitzer would move away from exaggerated journalism and set down important rules and boundaries for how we practice journalism today. Now he's known as the father of journalism. These weren't the only two men going after it at the time. In response to Pulitzer and Hearst's introduction of yellow journalism, Jewish American Adolph Ochs bought out the struggling New York Times newspaper and embraced the slogan, "All the news that's fit to print." Instead of entertainment and shock value, he stressed the importance of honest and trustworthy news gathering and reporting. And under his ownership, the New York Times became one of the world's most trusted sources in news. One of the first female journalists, at a time when women were not typically accepted in the field of journalism, Nellie Bly led the way in what's called investigative reporting, and was one of the first investigative reporters who took risks in order to expose wrongdoing. One of her most famous investigations involved her secretly admitting herself to an insane asylum in order to report about the abuse and neglect she found there. Journalist and radio broadcaster Dorothy Thompson, often called the First Lady of American journalism, was recognized by Time magazine in 1939 as the second most influential woman in America, next to the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And this was all at a time when most women were kept from positions of influence. She's best known for her work as a foreign correspondent, traveling the world and reporting on the news. Ida B. Wells was one of the first African American female journalists to break into the industry. She famously used her influence in journalism to fight to stop the lynching of black Americans. Her work earned her the reputation of a crusader for justice and a defender of democracy. Margaret Burke White was an early female photojournalist for the popular Life magazine. She famously covered the struggle of regular Americans to survive during the Great Depression, taking famous iconic photos like this one and this one, along with photographing and reporting on some of the world's most important events of her day, including taking iconic photos of leaders like Joseph Stalin and Gandhi. Probably the most famous war correspondent in history, Ernie Pyle was one of the first journalists who went into battle zones to report on what combat was like during wartime. He spent time telling stories from the front lines during World War II to help common people understand for the first time what war was like. In fact, while he was embedded with troops in a combat zone, he was killed in battle. A famous broadcast journalist who got his start in radio but would later appear on millions of Americans' televisions weekly, Edward R. Murrow was one of the first to bring serious news to the TV screen. He is most well known for his challenging of Senator Joseph McCarthy and McCarthy's House of Un-American Activity Committee, which falsely accused hundreds of Americans of being communist spies. Murrow continued to point out McCarthy's false witch hunt despite pressures and accusations he received himself. Murrow signed off each night's broadcast with the phrase, "Good night and good luck," which is also the name of an award-winning film about his life and his battle with Senator McCarthy. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were the first to report on one of the most famous news stories in American history. President Richard Nixon was found to be behind several men breaking into his political opponents' offices to steal vital information to help him keep his office. Woodward and Bernstein discovered and pressured an unnamed White House source to admit to the truth. As impressive was that their editor, Ben Bradlee, allowed them to print the story without naming their source so they could protect him. This is one of the first times that an anonymous source was used in a major news story. Known as the most trusted man in America, University of Texas graduate Walter Cronkite anchored the CBS Evening News, where he joined families across the nation through television on a nightly basis, reporting the day's news. His loyal viewers saw him report on many of the most significant events in American history, including the assassination of then-President John F. Kennedy. Let's take a look.
Meeting there. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
That same voice would also narrate for the world man's first steps on the moon. Take a look.
Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon.
Cronkite shared these events with America, all as a part of his regular 6 o'clock evening news. Another graduate of the University of Texas and a product of Texas high school journalism, Dan Rather anchored the CBS Evening News after Walter Cronkite, also becoming a household name that people trusted for their news. He also helped create one of the most popular investigative reporting TV news shows, 60 Minutes, where he provided in-depth information on the news of the week. William F. Buckley was the host of one of the nation's longest-running political commentary television programs called Firing Line, in which he stirred political discussions and debate. His style of program still dominates cable news networks to this day, and he essentially made politics a more important part of news today. And last but certainly not least, you should know Carl Rowan. He's one of the most honored reporters in the history of the United States, and his columns have been published in more than 100 newspapers across the country. Despite prejudices at the time, Rowan became a trusted voice of reason for many Americans. The press room at the U.S. State Department is named in his honor. This is just a small portion of some of the most famous and important journalists. You should do some research on your own to find out more about the people who've blazed the trail in journalism.